Welcome back to the City of Sheffield for the final time, and for the final time to a parish in South Yorkshire. Today we complete the county, and what a great place to finish it all off. Welcome to the biggest parish in England. This is Bradfield. Here's my disclaimer for people who may be watching me for the first time. I say things as I would in my native accent and dialect. As a result, I may not pronounce things in the same way as the locals do. Remember, I'm a visitor. It's impossible to know everything. Leave me a comment, spin me a like, and bash that subscribe button. Let's get to today's parish video. Bradfield, broad open land. Ladies and gentlemen, this day has been coming for a very long time. I welcome you all to what is a very long video. Today's trip is a lengthy run around the western fringes of the City of Sheffield as we take in the enormous parish of Bradfield. This is the largest in England in terms of size. Its extensive span covers a plethora of different villages and hamlets, as well as some of the western Sheffield suburbs. What makes that all the more amazing is that the majority of the western half of its area is dominated by Peak District moorland, with little to no population in it. Most people here live in the eastern half, the side dominated by places such as Stannington, Utley Bridge, Warl and Cliffside. The parish is named for High and Low Bradfield, two distinct villages midway between the moorland and the suburbs. The parish also includes several reservoirs built to supply Sheffield with water. Some of them have some rather interesting bits of history. There's simply way too much in this one to cover it all. What follows is a tour of the area that's mainly by vehicle, but there are some walking parts too. I hope you enjoy it, because after this one is done, TVI can officially cross off the first completed ceremonial county of England. So mob-handed, and for one last time in South Yorkshire, let's go. For the first three settlements of the many within Bradfield Parish, we won't be leaving the car. It's all driving. We start this journey around Bradfield Parish just south of Sheffield's border with Barnsley at Langset. This is Upper Midhope, located right on the edge of the Peak District National Park and at a local high point between Langset Reservoir and Midhope Reservoir. Archaically, Upper Midhope had a different name. It was once called Over Midhope, whilst its neighbour, Midhope Stones, was called Nether Midhope. This is a hamlet that dates back to at least the medieval period. Records of it go back to 1227, and archaeological evidence goes back even further. It was a traditional rural settlement, and its relatively high location meant sheep farming was the main economic activity. Interestingly though, beekeeping was also practiced here. At the end of the 19th century, land around Upper Midhope was acquired by Sheffield Corporation for the construction of several reservoirs. A number of dwellings were lost during the construction of the one at Langset, as well as a road that connected Upper Midhope to Langset village. Whilst farming is still the main occupation here, Upper Midhope has increasingly become residential. A lot of its former barns have been converted to housing. Upper Midhope became a conservation area in 1977. There's a number of historic buildings, including 4 listed structures dating from the 17th or 18th century. 3 of them are of timber-framed crook construction. Let's move on to Upper Midhope's neighbour, which is Midhope Stones, a little bit further down the road. Midhope Stones is just under 11 miles from Sheffield city centre, again near the northwestern edge of the city boundary, just off the A616. Again, we're between two reservoirs, this time Midhope and Underbank, and we're also in the valley of the Little Don River. It's here, in this village, where we'll come across our first church, St James. Keep your eyes to the left of the screen and you'll see it shortly as we make our way through these twisty country lanes. The current building dates from a 1705 rebuild, but St James's origins are 14th century. It was part of a manorial complex which had its own chapel. It's a listed building, and Midhope Stones has a few of those. Most are 17th or 18th century, and they're made of Yorkshire gritstone. If you've ever heard the saying true Yorkshire grit, well, now you know why it exists. There exists some documentary evidence from the 19th century of crook buildings and a mill in this village. Some structures date to earlier periods, including a cowhouse at Midhope Hall Farm, which is 14th century and includes part of a medieval courthouse. Another listed building is the local pub, called Ye Olde Mustard Pot, which used to be called the Midhope Stones Arms, and before that the Club Inn. Industrially, farming was less of a concern for Midhope Stones. In 1720, Midhope Pottery was the prime employer, and it produced general household ware. The village grew in the 18th century, its fields were enclosed, and by 1732 it even had its own school. Now it's not too dissimilar to Upper Midhope, very residential, and all the industry has gone. Midhope Pottery closed in 1845 due to more industrialised competition. Here's the pub. You'll find this near the Little Don River. It's a popular pub this, often frequented by walkers and cyclists, as well as passing traffic on the A616, which skirts the edge of the village. Midhope Stones Bridge, which is close to this, was built over the Little Don in around 1778. It's not the first that spanned that river though. It replaced an older one that was destroyed by a flood. Also nearby, there's a former toll bar house from the late 18th century, and that brings us to the road we're currently on. This is Mortimer Road, and it's a former turnpike. It was built from Penistone to Grindleford via Midhope in around 1771. Now, as we already know, there are reservoirs here, but that's not always been the case. One of them is thought to cover the very landmark from which Midhope Stones gets the Stones part of its name. Beneath Underbank Reservoir, historians believe there's a set of stepping stones which once crossed the river, now lost beneath the gentle waves. Underbank Reservoir was constructed by the Barnsley Corporation in 1919. As well as the stones, several houses and part of the former pottery were lost to its development. It may all be watery now and far less industrial, but the historical and archaeological interest of the buildings in Midhope Stones and its relatively preserved condition earned the village its conservation status in 1976, which was granted by Sheffield City Council. From Midhope Stones, if you head directly south, you're then following a route that feels mountainous. We're off to a place called Wigtwizzle next. There are some seriously steep gradients out here, but they do have the scenery to match. The hills don't last forever though, and they soon drop you into a stunning valley where we'll find our next hamlet. Next up, we have a place with perhaps the greatest name for a village ever, Wigtwizzle. Wigtwizzle derives the first part of its name from its former Anglo-Saxon owner, Wigca. The second part, Twizzle, means land where two streams meet. These streams are Alice Lane Dyke and Lee Lane Dyke, both of which flow into yet another reservoir, this time Broomhead. Wigtwizzle used to have a pub known as the Sportsman's Arms, which after closure was used by Sheffield City Council as a woodyard and has since been converted into a house. Although tiny, Wigtwizzle used to have a huge mansion. It was known as Wigtwizzle Hall, and it was believed to have been built in 1610. It no longer stands though now. It was demolished in 1935 and the stone was reused, partly to build both Broomhead and Moor Hall reservoirs. Broomhead Reservoir is on our left here, even though most of it is obscured by trees. To the south of the hamlet are Canyards Hills, a 64-hectare site of special scientific interest that was identified in 1990. Canyards possesses the most impressive examples in England and Wales of ridge and trough or tumbled ground. It sits beneath a 10-metre high cliff, and it's a chaotic mass of sub-parallel ridges separated by narrow areas of marshy ground. It's formed of upper Carboniferous millstone grit and has innumerable small millstone grit blocks that take up a large landslip. That was very difficult to say. Now we're coming into Brighthome Lane, and it's more of the same here. This one was previously a farming community though, there was no heavy industry here. It consisted of 4 farmsteads: Manor Farm, Old Hall Farm, High Lea Farm and Lea Farm. It's now almost entirely residential, with the last working farm being sold for development in 2013. Brighthome Lee's biggest piece of history is an old pack horse route called Townfield Road, which splits the hamlet into 2 pieces and continues northwards into Bolsterstone. It's generally accepted that the houses on the uphill side of the track are several hundred years older than those below. Brighthome Lee was once much bigger. Several ancient farm workers' cottages at the junction of Townfield Road and Brighthome Lee Lane were demolished in the mid-1970s. The 2 oldest buildings here now are High Lea Farm and Old Hall Farm. High Lea is unusual in that it's a rare example of a crook house. Most crook buildings are barns. It dates from the 17th century. There were originally 3 dwellings within the building, but this was later reduced to 2, with a cottage at one end and a farmhouse at the other. South of the hamlet is Swinnock Hall, which stands on the site of an original building which dated from 1416. The first hall was part of the estate of John Swinnock, and later residents included the Waterhouse and Bradshaw families. Many other buildings are of note too, but there's way too many to mention. So, in that case, let's move on to Cliffside. Okay, so for the first time we are out of the car, and I have Lauren with me.
Hello.
Who's opted to come with me on this short walk through Cliffside. We're not doing much here because there's still plenty more to cover. Those lanes were terrifying, weren't they? Were quite narrow and a bit of a maze, to be honest with you.
The main bits that were terrifying for me is when you could just see on your left those steep drops in woodland.
Down to the reservoirs.
Yeah,
Unbelievable. Right, okay, we'll have a short walk through Cliffside and then we'll move on to the next one. At last we are out of the car. Cliffside is the first of the big villages within Bradfield Parish, but it's too big to walk around fully. For this one, all we're doing is covering the main thoroughfare, Brighthome Lee Lane. Being honest, this is where most of the main landmarks are anyway. First up we have a school, Cliffside Primary, which opened in 1979. 5 years ago, in 2019, the school held a celebration which marked the 40th anniversary of its nursery. It was referred to as a groovy day. Oh, to have been a kid in the 70s, I can only imagine what it would have been like back then. Next is the community centre. There's a reason this is next door. It used to be what's known as a horser hut, provided by the government in 1944 when the school leavers age was raised to 15. The horser huts were flat pack and temporary, designed to cater for the extra class as a result. It's been rebuilt now, of course. As we continue down Brighthome Lee Lane, we pass the local shop and post office and a Chinese takeaway on the left, but other than these, the rest of the road is residential. The same can be said for most of Cliffside until you reach Main Road at the foot of the hill. That's where we find the Blue Ball. This traditional, cosy pub dates back to the 1800s and was originally 3 houses. It was later to become a Whitbread's Exchange Brewery pub. It had been long-term closed until last year, but now open again, it's a great little boozer. It serves food too. Now, confusingly, not all of Cliffside is within the parish of Bradfield. Part of it is within Stocksbridge. The piece which is over the border has perhaps the most interesting thing that Cliffside possesses. I'm talking about Warncliffe Crag and the Dragon of Wantley. Warncliffe Crag is a 2-mile-long gritstone escarpment which was formed 320 million years ago in the Paleozoic era. Industrially, the rocks have been rather important out here. For several centuries, as long ago as the Iron Age in fact, they've been quarried to produce quernstones. Even the name Wharncliffe actually evolved from the term quern cliff. The production process has left behind considerable evidence, including work flooring and trackways, as well as many abandoned querns. A survey by English Heritage in the year 2000 suggested there are as many as 8,000 quernstones in the quarry today. The quern production area has now been declared a scheduled ancient monument. Wharncliffe Lodge stands at the southern end of the crags and has fine views of the Uden Valley to the west. The present building dates from the 19th century, and it's the third lodge on the site, the original having been built in 1510. The lodge has strong associations with Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, who resided there for short periods in the early 18th century. The floor of one of the rooms bears the inscription of Henry VIII's reign from 1509 to 1547. The level terrain behind the central part of the crag is known as Wharncliffe Chase. This was part of a royal hunting park in the Middle Ages. More recently, the chase was mined for ganister, which was used to produce furnace bricks for the local steel industry. The crag is perhaps best known though for a famous myth. The Dragon of Wantley is the legend of a dragon slaying by a knight, which was recounted in a comic broadside ballad of 1685. In 1737, the ballad was adapted into one of the most successful operas ever to appear in London. The ballad tells of how a huge dragon, almost as big as the Trojan horse, devours anything it wishes, even trees and buildings, until it encounters the Falstaffian knight More of More Hall. More obtains a bespoke suit of spiked Sheffield armour and delivers a fatal kick to the dragon's only vulnerable spot, which is rather comically known as its arsegut. There's a cave at the southern end of the crag close to Wharncliffe Lodge called the Dragon's Den, which is marked as such on maps. The dragon was reputed to reside in that den and to fly across the valley to Alman Well on Waldershelf Ridge above Deepcar. There's a representation of the dragon above Moor Hall on the opposite side of the valley to Wharncliffe Crag, where a snaking stone wall culminating in a carved dragon's head can be found near Bitholmes Wood. There's also a frieze of a knight killing a dragon in the entrance of Sheffield Town Hall, said to be a representation of the tale. Oh, and why is it Wantley, you ask? Well, Wharncliffe was formerly known in the local vernacular as Wantley, hence the name. Okay, I'll wait for you, Lauren. We're out of the car again here. We're still in Wharncliffe side. We've got one other thing to cover before we leave this behind and move on to Utley Bridge, which is the next settlement along this massive route of ours. Now here, you can see we're on a narrow track which has no vehicular access except for access. Now, that's not a problem because there's a little car park here. You see, so you don't actually have to go up there. Now, this is the road you would walk up if you were going into Glen Howe Park. Now, we're not going to go all the way through the park. What's the most interesting thing about this is a tower which is at its sort of entrance. So we're going to head for that and then basically come back and move on to Utley Bridge. I have to cover this park, otherwise Utley Bridge won't make sense. Wharncliffe side also has one other main thing of note, Glen Howe Park. This is a public recreation area which covers 19 acres in the valley of the Tinker Brook, a minor tributary of the River Don. The park was set up in 1881 through the patronage of a local businessman, Joseph Dixon, and a landowner and stonemason, John Mills. Dixon was the owner of the nearby Spring Grove paper mill at Utley Bridge, which we'll talk more about in a moment. Mills was responsible for landscaping the park. He would build this, Glen Howe Tower, at the main entrance, where he lived until 1917. In the 1890s, charities such as the Ragged School Union, the Fresh Air Group and local police forces brought groups of poor children from Sheffield's slums to play in this park. In 1913, tennis courts were built on the site of a medieval manor house. Glen Howe was gifted to Wortley District Council by Dixon and Mills in 1917, and in 1925 a pack horse bridge was dismantled and brought here from the Uden Valley. It would have otherwise been inundated by the waters of the Moor Hall Reservoir. It's now a Grade 2 listed building. In 1971, ownership of the park passed to Sheffield City Council. I'll be honest with you, I'm pleased I've found the pack horse bridge. I thought it was further into the park than this. Look at this gentle cascade, the stream coming down and underneath the bridge. It's absolutely beautiful. Loads of things like this out here in Bradfield. Isn't it great, Lolly?
Yeah.
Okay, time to move on to Utley Bridge. And now we're coming into Utley Bridge. First up here in the biggest settlement so far is the site of the paper mill, which was owned by the Dixons. As you can see, it's not exactly industrial now. The Dixon family bought the mill in 1871 and it became a flourishing business, being one of the first to use wood pulp to produce paper instead of rags. It specialised in tissues, making the Dixel brand for many years. Wood pulp for the mill was imported from Finland from 1931 until 1985. The factory had several owners after the Dixons sold the mill in the 1970s, namely British Tissues, Jaymont UK and the Fort James Corporation. In 2000, it became part of the Georgia Pacific Group. The mill closed in 2007, leaving only converting lines operational, with the 2 tissue machines being mothballed. All production ceased completely in 2015. A year later, planning for up to 320 homes was secured here, which saw the demolition of the former industrial buildings and the construction of a brand new residential development. As part of the work, a new bridge was built across the River Don to give access to the site. Now we're driving into Utley Bridge village, south of the mill site. We're now about 5 miles northwest of the city centre in the valley of the River Don. Utley Bridge is characterised by its long, thin village centre and a one-way system for traffic. The population of this village has increased significantly in recent years because of much private housing development, such as that at the mill site. It stood at 3,584 in 2011. Utley Bridge accounts for more than 1/6 of Bradfield Parish's population. The origins of Utley Bridge date back to the 12th century when a ford existed in the area over the Don. It was managed by a man who resided in a nearby cottage. His name was Uhtred, but he had the nickname Uti. When a bridge was built to replace the ford in 1150, it became known as Uti's Bridge, and the settlement around it adopted the same name. Utley Bridge also includes a small hamlet called Wandsacre, approximately half a mile to the west. Its history goes back to Anglo-Saxon times, when it was part of the estate of the Saxon Lord Godric. The Wandsacre estate was owned by the Larousse family after the Norman conquest until around 1380, when it passed to the Steads. They were large landowners in the Sheffield and Hallamshire area. Wandsacre Hall has been standing since the 17th century and it's Grade 2 listed. Let's have a little walk around Utley Bridge now. Again, like Cliffside, this won't be all that extensive. Let's start at the River Don. Without this, Utley Bridge could never have grown to become the settlement it is today. Utley Bridge was, for several centuries, a small, isolated hamlet, and even as recently as 1747, it was only made up of 5 families. However, the population started to rise in the 18th century as a result of an expansion in farming and the Industrial Revolution. The village's position within the Don Valley made it a prime location, as the sheer power of the river could be used to drive machinery. The main business was a forge. It still stands today, but it's now a block of flats. Modern-day Utley Bridge is a commuter village, and much of the local industry has given way to private housing development. That said, it still does well enough for itself. There's a number of pubs, including this one, the White Hart, which used to be a bridal shop. Others include the Pheasant, which is now a bar and grill, the Cock Inn, the Traveller's Rest, and the Hare and Hounds. The village has a small green at its centre, a peaceful haven despite the noise of the main A6102 in the background. This has an ornately carved stone with depictions of the industry here at one time. Church Street is another main road that leads west towards High Bradfield. This is the location of the parish church of the Ascension, built in 1842, and also the Hare and Hounds pub, which dominates the corner between it and Langsett Road. Buried within this eclectic maze of pubs, flats and shops, there's also a school, although local children also travel to Warl in order to attend Bradfield School too. Utley Bridge has a good selection of shops and businesses on the Langsett Road. These include a general store, an estate agent's, a beauty salon and a couple of eateries. The whole thing used to be served by Utley Bridge railway station, which opened in 1845 and closed in 1959. The old gritstone station house still stands, but it's now a dwelling, having been converted in 2008. When the station was in use, the goods sidings were used for carrying wood pulp to the nearby paper mill, and also for freight to and from the Utley Bridge silica works, which were taken over by the Steelworks Company in 1947. The site of the works on Station Lane closed in the 1980s, and half of it has been redeveloped for housing. It's certainly all changed now. And the site of the old Utley Bridge railway station, we're back here at the junction again, is over there. You can see we've got the river and the bridge going over the river, and the road leads up there towards the old station and the forge, and that's where that was located. Okay, time to move on. We're now going to go down into Middlewood, and this is a different kettle of fish entirely. On now to Middlewood, which is a northwestern suburb of Sheffield. Greatly urbanised these days, Middlewood was formerly an entirely rural location which has been continually encroached upon by the city's expansion since the 1960s. Not all of Middlewood falls within Bradfield's boundaries. Notable landmarks which don't include the Middlewood training ground used by English Football League side Sheffield Wednesday. Essentially, there's only two major parts of Middlewood that do, but in my opinion, they are the most important. Here we're driving around Wadsley Park Village, which was constructed between 2001 and 2006. Before this was an expanse of modern housing, this area of Middlewood was occupied by two hospitals. They were called Warncliffe and Middlewood. Warncliffe was a small medical hospital, whilst Middlewood was a large psychiatric hospital. Middlewood was opened in 1872 and was originally known as the South Yorkshire Asylum. It then became the West Riding Asylum in 1890, Wadsley Mental Hospital in 1930, and finally Middlewood Hospital in 1948. It had its own working farm, operated by the residents until the early 1960s, and also its own church. It's now gone, but parts of it do still stand. And if you know where to go, you can see them. By the 1970s, it became clear that future psychiatric treatment would be based on general hospital units and daycare facilities. As early as 1984, Middlewood's management team were planning the running down of the hospital. Middlewood held just 600 patients in 1986, and it finally closed a decade later. It had a couple of notable patients, but the one that stands out the most would be the poet David Midzniak. He spent time at the hospital in the late 1970s while being treated for autism, which ironically was the catalyst for his poetic interest. Certain parts of Middlewood Hospital, such as the lodge and the former Kingswood ward, were listed buildings and couldn't be demolished, so instead they've been incorporated into the estate. The lodge, which is on Middlewood Road, is now part of a brand new nursery. Kingswood ward has been converted into flats. The same thing happened to these buildings, the former administration block and clock tower. They were converted into 38 luxury apartments after permission to demolish them was denied. Now renamed Middlewood Lodge, it's the most iconic hospital structure still standing. So Nikki spotted that there's a church here too. We're just walking down this muddy path towards it. It's right close to the entrance to Middlewood Lodge, and here it is. You can see it's a little bit on the derelict and abandoned side, but I guess we're okay just here. No public right of way beyond this fence.
It is. So what it would have been is that this would have been the church that was attached to the asylum, because every asylum was also a very committed, like a Christian place. So this would be the church where the patients would have come and done Sunday service and so on, and where funerals and things would have been held for those that had died whilst they were in those that had died while they were under the asylum's care.
Long-time viewers will remember we did see that same setup in Bracebridge Heath a long time ago, where we saw the old St John's hospital and the church that still stands next to it, and it's still in use as well. But this is a bit different.
If you go online, there's a forum called 28 Days Later, and on that forum there's lots of explores of lunatic asylums within the UK. So you've got places like, I don't know if they did anything in Middlewood before it was changed, but Reservoirs in Colchester, High Roads in Leeds, West Park that's down in Surrey, there's one in Epsom, North Wales Hospital Denbigh. There's lots of them. They were literally a county asylum in every county, or pretty much every county in the UK, sometimes more than one. And they all had a similar setup. They were set up to be self-sufficient places where they might have had a bit of farm, they would have had their own well, They would have had their own kitchens, they would have had a staff, they would have had a little hospital, so they would have had nurses and you know, well, they were essentially a big hospital anyway, but what I'm talking about is not a mental hospital, but an actual hospital for physical conditions, you know, like, I don't know, people who stop walking or whatever, you know, that kind of thing. So they were all pretty much meant to be self-sufficient, and having a church on the grounds was also one of them things. But having a look online at such as 28 Days Later, there's lots and lots of information there in the public domain about these places. They're a relic of bygone Victorian England, and it's certainly a bit like the wars. These places should never be forgotten because they were cruel. In many ways they were cruel. People came in teenagers and left as pensioners.
Between Middlewood and our next village is Hillsborough Golf Club. I don't want to dwell on this too much because we've still got a lot to cover. The course was created in 1920 with the clubhouse added in 1936. Hillsborough is renowned for being one of the best golfing venues in the north of England. Its lofty perch in the Sheffield Hills means the course gives some truly fantastic and panoramic views over the Steel City and the surrounding countryside. Let's move on to the next place. Next up we have Warl, and it was here where we encountered a parish notice board. Let's get Bradfield marked off. Warl is 4 miles northwest of Sheffield city centre. It borders the Sheffield suburbs of Wadsley, Middlewood and Loxley to the south and east, and Utley Bridge to the north. To the west is a rural area extending towards Bradfield. Like Utley Bridge, Warl is centred around a small green. This one's got another ornately carved stone, this time a lasting memorial to the NHS heroes in the COVID-19 pandemic. It also has an ancient stone trough, not an uncommon sight out here. Facing Warl Road there's also a war memorial. The largest in Bradfield Parish is in Stannington, and we'll see that later. Next we need to make our way through the Warl Recreation Ground. Now on the face of it this doesn't look all that interesting, but you know I wouldn't be filming it if that was the case. Industrially, Warl was all about ganister mining and quarrying. This used to be part of the largest quarry that the place had. The rest is now a housing estate. It was called Middlewood Quarry, and stone from it was used to build the famous wicker arches in the centre of Sheffield. Apparently, I need to do this hopscotch.
Yes, because me and Mo have done it. You haven't.
The things I do for this channel.
There's no climbing frame in this one, at least think yourself lucky.
Just so you know, I haven't done this since I was a kid. I'm 40 years old, just so you know.
So I've not done it in years either.
And that was terrible. But hey, it was entertaining at least, eh? On Mausoleums Lane we find the gates of Middlewood Hall, the other major Middlewood landmark that falls within Bradfield's boundaries. Grade 2 listed and set in 54 acres of grounds and gardens, Middlewood Hall was constructed in 1810 by Mark Skelton, although a farmhouse is believed to have existed on the site well before that. The Skeltons were a family of steel merchants who owned forges on the River Don. The early 20th century saw it change hands twice, first to the Thorpe family and their servants in 1911, and then again in 1926 to the Wilsons, who were local snuff makers. In 1980, Warncliffe Construction turned it into a luxury hotel. After changing hands twice more as a hotel, it was purchased by a private individual in 1999 who converted it back into a private family dwelling. And speaking of dwellings, that's pretty much what the rest of this part of Warl is about. It's a mostly residential village with a mixture of old and new housing. Most of its residents are commuters, and being this close to Sheffield is a definite advantage. Warl has a higher than average proportion of older people, with 32% of the population here aged between 45 and 64. Warl does have a few amenities of its own despite being quite a small village compared to the others we've already seen. On Hagstones Road there's a hairdresser's, and at the top of the hill is the Blue Ball, believed to have been originally 2 cottages which were connected to make a bigger premises. On Towngate Road there's an old independent chapel. This dates from 1878 and it has a foundation stone which was laid by John Wycliffe Wilson. This is Warl's oldest part. It would have grown up around this area, with the ganister and quarrying industries requiring housing for its workers. Next we come to Warl's main communal building. This is the Warl Memorial Hall, which is a venue for local social and fundraising activities, and it's situated right next to Sycamore Park. Warl Male Voice Choir, which was formed in 1970, have been known to frequent this building a few times. Sycamore Park is a public recreation area situated between Towngate Road and Brighthfield Lane. This is much smaller than the Warl Recreation Ground, being only 3.46 acres, but it still has a playground, a mini football pitch, a cycle track, and an array of picnic benches. Nice spot. Hall Farm Mews gives us a clue to the farming history of the village. There are still several farms on the periphery of Warl, but the activity is much reduced from the 19 that existed here in the 1930s. The last farm to operate in the centre of Warl was the Wigan Dairy Farm on Towngate Road. Lastly on this walk is the Shoulder of Mutton, the second of the two pubs, this time on Top Lane. This was formerly a pair of farm buildings, but has been a pub since at least 1817. It was modernised in the 1980s, and it's still going strong today. Let's go to a school next. This is Bradfield School on Kirkedge Road. It's a secondary school which has academy status and is a specialist engineering college, formerly catering for pupils between the ages of 11 and 18. However, in 2019 the school's sixth form closed down, and it now only caters to those children aged between 11 and 16. It was built in 1957. Warl doesn't have a primary school. Education in the village can be traced back though to a national school, which was founded in 1848. It eventually closed in 1966, with its pupils transferring to Utley Bridge. The old schoolhouse is now a private residence. Bradfield School is now the only educational establishment here, and it serves approximately 1,000 pupils. Our next stop was Loxley, which Nikki was really looking forward to, and you'll see why shortly. This here is Loxley Nurseries, right on the edge of the village. Both Nikki and Lauren at this point wanted to have a little break from the journey, so I left them here for a short time while I went to explore the first part of Loxley myself. As well as this nursery, by the way, there's a second one nearby called Langlands. That one describes itself more as a community hub than a nursery. So leaving the girls behind, let's take a short drive now into the main Loxley village, and there's plenty here. The word Loxley means Links Glade. As a settlement it's defined as both a village and a suburb these days, but it was originally just another rural hamlet, much like those we've already covered. The area in which it stands was moorland. It's now a long, linear community which stretches east to west along the side of the River Loxley and the B6077 or Loxley Road for almost 2.5 miles. It consists almost exclusively of residential housing, but it did have some industrial activity in the past. That was in the Loxley Valley, originally an extensive woodland south of the village. Whilst most of the more productive ground in the valley was turned over to farming, Loxley harnessed the power of its river in much the same way as Utley Bridge did with the Don. During the 1800s, the valley became an important producer of refractory bricks for the expanding Sheffield steel industry. The centre of Loxley is defined as the junction of Loxley Road and this street, Rodney Hill, which climbs a steep gradient northwestwards towards Sheffield. The junction is where the old village green is located, and the street is named after a pub at its foot called the Admiral Rodney. Partway up this hill, which by the way gives some great views into the Loxley Valley, there's a bus shelter which was decorated by the children from Loxley Primary School next door. It's the only school in Loxley. It was built in 1911 and serves just over 200 pupils between the ages of 4 and 11. You'll note that Loxley Primary School's logo features a rather familiar figure, Robin Hood. Although he's more associated with Nottinghamshire, Loxley is believed by many to be the place in which he was born. Many sources claim he was born in an area called Little Haggis Croft, which is close to where this property, Normandale House, halfway up Rodney Hill, stands today. Although nobody knows for sure if he was actually born here, or indeed if he even existed, there are plenty of clues. These trees are sort of a proof, if you like, that Loxley's Robin Hood connection makes a bit of sense. It might all be housing these days, but there was once an extensive forest here called Loxley Chase, which stretched as far south as Nottinghamshire, where it joined up with Sherwood Forest. Ballads from the High Middle Ages, such as A Gist of Robin Hood, Robin Hood and the Monk, Robin Hood and Guy of Gisborne, and Robin Hood and the Potter, all point to a possible South Yorkshire birth for the legend. So too does Sir Walter Scott's 1820 novel, Ivanhoe. In any event, we found our way through a mixture of steep suburban streets and some pretty dense woodland to Loxley Road now. Now, Loxley has no active religious buildings, but it used to have this Methodist chapel built in 1885. This closed and was sold into private ownership in 2012. Loxley also had a former United Reformed church close to Warl Lane, which was constructed in 1787. It closed in 1993 and became a private dwelling too, although the burial ground is still used today. There are no shops here despite the size of the place. Most of the residents commute to nearby Hillsborough to do their shopping. That said, there was once a shop and a post office. Now boarded up and disused, you're looking at it here. A bit further up the road is the Wisewood Inn, the second of Loxley's two pubs. Even though this is older, arguably it's the Admiral Rodney that's the more notable. It was named after George Bridges Rodney, the first Baron, after his defeat of the French in the Battle of the Somme in 1782. Technically, Loxley has a third pub, but it's actually in a separate hamlet out to the west, and we'll be passing it later. Now, before we leave Loxley behind, we've got one more thing to cover. These are the gates of Wisewood Cemetery, one of the largest of all in Sheffield. This has a very famous grave. Now, while I've been doing all that in Loxley, the girls have obviously been in the nurseries and they've walked down to the cemetery because it's in there where we're going next. There's a very famous grave in Wisewood Cemetery and I'm going to hand over to Nikki to tell you all about it. So who's buried here then, Nikki?
So, just where the rose bushes are to the right hand side, you'll see one of the founder members of the British rock group Def Leppard.
Shall we get a bit closer to him?
We certainly will.
Okay, here he is.
Yep, so here we've got the grave of Steve Clark. Unfortunately, because of the wet weather, the engraving on the side of the grave is being a little bit obscured by the water, but generally, you know, the images is that of Steve Clark with his guitar slung low in his classic sort of way, and then the Def Leppard band logo underneath. Steve passed away in 1991 of alcohol and drug related issues. He was sadly very, very young. He was only 30, and it was a life tragically cut short, and he is missed to this day.
So the reason you know about this grave, Nikki, is because you're a massive fan of Def Leppard, aren't you?
Definitely, I certainly am. And Def Leppard still continue to play, to tour, to record today, but very often they do pay tribute to the late Steve Clark, and you know, we'll mention him usually in folder notes on the albums, we mention him in concerts and so on and so forth, and we have seen it quite a lot. I appear to have also discovered that it looks like there is another member of the Clark family buried here. I'm not quite sure which one it is, so we will have to sort of look that up. But yeah, so here we have Steve Clark.
To the west of Loxley is the hamlet of Stacy Bank, and this has a massive landmark. Yes, once again, we're in the vicinity of another reservoir, this time Damflask. Aside from Langset, it's the easiest of all the water features to access in the parish of Bradfield. Damflask Reservoir has a capacity of 4,250 million litres and has a surface area of 47 hectares. Its maximum depth is 27 metres and the dam wall is approximately 400 metres wide. In short, it ain't small. Damflask was built as part of a larger group in this area, the others being Strines, Agden and Dale Dyke. The four of them supply fresh drinking water and a guaranteed supply of running water to the population and industries of Sheffield. Damflask was completed in 1896 and takes its name from Damflask village, which was washed away in the Great Sheffield Flood in 1864. It was never rebuilt afterwards because plans were already in place to construct the reservoir. Seems convenient, but I guess it did save on demolition costs. As for the rest of Stacy Bank, it's just a collection of houses, but there is a pub called the Nag's Head. Holdworth is an ancient farming settlement which was mentioned in the Domesday Book. Prior to the Norman conquest, it was a small Anglo-Saxon farming community and was owned by the Saxon lord Hilfdene or Aldine, who also held land in the nearby settlements of Wadsley, Warl and Ughill. After the conquest, ownership of Holdworth passed to our good friend Roger de Busley. Blimey, it's been a while since we mentioned him. He'd been given extensive lands by William the Conqueror across Nottinghamshire and Yorkshire for his part in the conquest. By far and away the most important name associated with Holdworth is Morwood. The Morwood family rose from humble beginnings in the 13th century to become part of Hallamshire's aristocracy 400 years later. Records show they held land at Holdworth in 1411 through John de Morwood. Another eminent Hallamshire family with connections to Holdworth were the Steads. Thomas Stead was the builder of Hillsborough House. He held an estate of over 2,000 acres on his death in 1793, including land at Holdworth. The oldest building in Holdworth is Farhouse Farm, which is 17th century and Grade 2 listed. There are 5 other buildings of note in the hamlet too, a lot for a small place. Now if you drive through Holdworth for its entire length, you'll end up back on Kirkedge Road again, which as we already know runs to Warl. In the other direction it goes to High Bradfield. Off this road is a convent, known locally as Kirk Edge Convent. This stands 2 kilometres to the west of Warl and was built in 1871. It's a monastery of the Carmelite Order of Nuns, and obviously we can't really see much more of it than this. Let's move on to High Bradfield next then, shall we, where we can see a lot more. We start our trip around the Bradfields at the Old Horns Inn. Currently closed for some renovation, the Old Horns was built in around 1830 and was previously used as a farm. Listed buildings are plentiful here. Over the road, there's at least 4 of them. That's where you'll see the former Bradfield Parish Workhouse, which was in operation between 1759 and 1847. The building was converted into private houses in the 1870s. Thousands of documents relating to the workhouse were found in a hidden cupboard in the 1950s, and these are now in the Bradfield Parish archives. Now so far we've been flitting in and out of the Peak District on this journey, but here in Bradfield we are most definitely in it. The village is 1.3 miles inside the park's northeastern boundary at an altitude of 850 feet above sea level. This gives it some great extensive views across Bradfield Dale towards Derwent Edge and the Dark Peak. The best place to see them is from the churchyard. The weather could have been better, but hey, you can't have it all. The medieval Church of St Nicholas is High Bradfield's most striking feature. This is one of only 5 Grade 1 listed buildings in all of Sheffield. The church was open, so let's have a little look around inside. It's built in the Gothic Perpendicular style and dates from the 1480s. It incorporates elements of an earlier church that may have been built in the 12th century, and it may stand on the site of an Anglo-Saxon place of worship. Neither of those things are known for sure. This is because High Bradfield wasn't mentioned in the Domesday Book, but it may have been one of the 16 hamlets recorded in the manor of Hallam. It was formerly known as Kirkton. This wooden tablet is a roll of honour, one of the many interesting features inside this one. North of the church is Bailey Hill, a 10.5 metre high man-made conical mound. The date and purpose of its construction are unknown, but it's generally accepted it was either a Saxon fort or a Norman Motte and Bailey castle. The eastern and southern flanks of the Bailey are enclosed by a 95 metre long curving earthwork, while to the west it's protected by steep slopes. As you can see, this churchyard isn't exactly flat, it's a lot steeper than the camera makes it look too. Let's head back through the churchyard now and into the rest of High Bradfield. There's not a great deal more to it. Up a steep hill we go next along the cobbles of Jane Street. In doing so, we pass a house called the Old Post Office, which was formerly an inn known as Heaven House or Heaven's Gate, and we emerge onto Brown House Lane. This is the road which connects Wigtwizzle with Loxley. On this there's a couple of interesting buildings, including the old rectory, seen here hiding behind a high wall. However, I thought most of the historic structures were to be found in Low Bradfield, the sister village in the upper Loxley Valley. The two villages are linked by the steep Woodfall Lane. Just before we leave High Bradfield, we have one last thing to discuss. This has always been a farming community and the present day village is still dominated by it, but one of its farms is now a bit more than that. This is What House Farm. It's a dairy, but it's also unique in that it's the base of Bradfield Brewery. The brewery occupies a converted barn and brews farmers' ales. Over the past 20 years, What Farm have gone from milking 100 cows a day to brewing over 100,000 pints of beer a week. I don't know about you, but I know which one I prefer. The brewery sprung to life with the completion of its first brew on the 26th of April 2005, and the beer has continued flowing ever since. Not wanting the cows to feel left out, some of the beers you can buy here are named after breeds of cattle. Farmers' ales travel across the UK from Northampton to Northumberland, East Coast to West Coast, and travellers take them further. They've even been pictured in Spain and Mexico before now. This is Low Bradfield, which is much bigger than its loftier neighbour. It's got far more amenities-wise. There's a small shop at the foot of Woodfall Lane, but there's way more here in terms of recreation and community. The centre of Low Bradfield is defined by a massive cricket pitch and a bowls club, which only add to its charm as a typical rural Peak District village. At weekends, Low Bradfield can become quite crowded, especially when there's a cricket match on. In much the same way as its neighbour, Low Bradfield has an information board on the green telling you a bit about the place. Housing wise, it's mostly the same as it was in High Bradfield, ancient looking stone cottages which are all quite pretty. Business wise, there's a few here. On the corner of Lamb Hill is Bradfield Cars and Classics. This should not be confused with Bradfield Cars in London. I almost made that mistake myself. Now we're on School Lane and we're crossing the River Loxley. This stretch of the Loxley is a twisty, meandering link between Agden and Damflask Reservoirs. There's no school on School Lane, but there used to be. It was washed away thanks to a flood in 1864 and rebuilt elsewhere. It's not just the village that's attractive for visitors. The surrounding countryside draws many from the more urban parts of Sheffield. Looking back to where we've just come from, we can see the old police house on the end of School Lane. It always makes me wonder just how policing works in these parts. Low Bradfield has just the one public house. This is it, the Bradfield Plough. There was a second pub called the Cross Inn, which was situated at the foot of Woodfall Lane, but that closed in the late 1970s. Opposite the pub is an ice cream parlour, and we were tempted, but Nikki is on a diet.
There's a brilliant sign in that ice cream parlour. I couldn't agree with it more.
Oh yeah?
It says dessert solves everything. Can't disagree with that, can we?
I must admit, I have heard worse theories, to be honest with you. Around the next corner we have the filter works, and the clue is in the name. These used to filter water from the reservoirs in Bradfield Dale. They were built in 1913 and were last used in 1995, at which time they were replaced by a water treatment works in the Loxley Valley. There are several other notable buildings in the village. This is a former Wesleyan chapel built in 1899. It closed in 1993 and was sold for residential use. The building it replaced is this, a much older Wesleyan chapel built in 1817, which now serves as the offices for Bradfield Parish Council. A couple more steps and we meet the River Loxley again, and this time it's a lot more picturesque, isn't it? We were quite taken by the family of ducks, who were quite happy with the rainy weather. Happier than us anyway. Check out this absolutely gorgeous stone bridge, which carries the road over the river here, by the way. Close by we have the former Low Bradfield School. This was built in 1867 to replace the school that was washed away in the flood. More on that in a little while. It closed in 1985 and its pupils were transferred to Dungworth. It's now been turned into a very popular cafe. And now we're back at the cricket ground. The pitch is known to the locals as the Ibbotson Memorial Field. It was named after the Ibbotson family, who have lived in Low Bradfield for several centuries. In the summer, it's not uncommon to see plenty of people enjoying a picnic on this. The last landmark here is the village hall. This was completely rebuilt recently and reopened to the public in 2006. And that's really it for Low Bradfield. I much preferred this to High Bradfield, although that of course doesn't take anything away from the latter. Let's move on to the next place. It's worth noting that the earliest historical sign of settlement in the Bradfield area is an early to mid-Bronze Age ring cairn on Broomhead Moors, 3 miles to the northwest of Low Bradfield. It's believed to have been a ritual or a burial site from over 4,000 years ago. Also on the ridge between Bradfield Dale and the Uden Valley is the Bar Dyke, a 492-yard-long trench which marked the boundary between different tribes in the Dark Ages, following the withdrawal of the Romans from Britain. Our next location is Ugg Hill, directly south of Low Bradfield. To get to this you have to climb a steep hill. Where it flattens out at the top, a side road appears off to the left and it leads to this. Its lofty position on a ridge between Bradfield Dale and the valley of the Ugg Hill Brook is a whopping 918 feet above sea level. Your ears certainly start popping up here. Ugg Hill has traditionally been a farming community, but there was some mining in the area in the late 19th and 20th centuries. It's known mostly for an infamous murder. The Ugg Hill Hall shootings, as they're known, occurred on the 21st of September 1986 at Ugg Hill Hall. Ian Wood shot and killed his mistress Danielle Ledez and her daughter Stephanie, and severely injured another child. Afterwards, he went on the run for 8 days. He was captured in France after threatening to commit suicide by jumping off Amiens Cathedral. He was later convicted of double murder, attempted murder, and theft. This next section is mainly remote rural scenery. We're at the far western edge of Bradfield Parish here, where the landscape is less about villages and more about the moorlands. With not much to see other than the wilderness for a while, this is the ideal time to throw in a mention of the Great Sheffield Flood. In 1864, the dam wall of Dale Dyke Reservoir was breached, causing the flood and the deaths of quite a few people. 17 people died in the Loxley area, and most of the industrial mills in the Loxley Valley were either destroyed or severely damaged. They were, however, quickly rebuilt with compensation money from the water company. Low Bradfield was the first populated place to be flooded. This makes sense because the dam wall was just 1 mile to the west of that village. Surprisingly though, there was only one fatality in that village, a 1-day-old infant, but that's mainly because the word had spread throughout the immediate area that there was a leak in the earth embankment, and the community was pretty well prepared for the tragedy. The village though was extensively damaged. 2 bridges, a corn mill, a blacksmith's shop, the schoolroom and the schoolmaster's house, and a farmhouse were all swept away in the disaster. It's referred to usually as the Forgotten Flood of Sheffield. Now I've made a stop along this road for one reason and one reason only, and that's because if you look to your right there's a massive valley and there is a building in the valley. It's the only building you can see for miles around. It looks like a castle tower. Well, it's actually called Boots Folly. Boots Folly. Now you can walk to it, but I'm a bit short of time here, and as you can see the weather is not very good. If I tried to walk down there I'd probably slip over and cause myself a massive injury, but you can see the building in question. So here's a few pictures of it up close and a little bit of information of what it is and why it's there. Boots Folly is also known occasionally as the Strines or Sugworth Tower. It was constructed in 1927 by Charles Boot, who resided at the nearby Sugworth Hall. The 45-foot-high square tower with its castellated top and flagpole was built from leftover stone from the building of the nearby Bent's house. The stone came from the disused Bent's farm, Pear's House farm and Nether Holes farm, which had been demolished because they were suspected of polluting the waters in the Dale. It's thought that Boots Folly was constructed to provide work for Sugworth Hall's workmen during the Depression. There's also a theory, however, that Boots built the tower so that he could see High Bradfield's churchyard, where his wife, who died in 1926, is buried. Today the interior is bare, but it originally had wood panelling and a large furnished room at the top where the Boot family could enjoy the view. There was also a spiral staircase to the top, but this was removed some years ago after a cow climbed the stairs and became stuck. The Folly is Grade 2 listed and gives fine views over the nearby reservoirs and, of course, Bradfield Dale. Alright, so now we've come through Bradfield Dale and Strines and we're on the A57. This is a very famous road. West of Sheffield, the A57 becomes the Snake Pass. We will be covering that as we dive deeper into Derbyshire, but for the purposes of this episode, we're going the other way. The A57 follows another valley at this point, that of the Rivlin. The area formed part of the Chase of Rivlin until the late 16th century and was used for occasional deer hunting by the Duke of Norfolk. It's a sparsely populated area, but there is one small settlement along its length, Hollow Meadows. It was originally known as Orley Meadows, named for the Hawley family based in Fulwood, which is now a western suburb of Sheffield. The A57 was built through Hollow Meadows as the Sheffield to Glossop Turnpike in 1821. Now, of course, where there's a turnpike, there's usually coaching inns. Hollow Meadows was no exception. The Surrey Arms pub was constructed alongside the road in 1822 to serve travellers. It was later renamed the Norfolk Arms as a nod to the Duke and its hunting associations. In around 1896, it reopened as the new Norfolk Arms on a site at the bottom of Loxley Lane. It later became a bus terminus, but that closed in the mid-2000s. Hollow Meadows used to have a collection of mausoleums. In 1831, Isaac Bright, a prominent Jewish jeweller based in Sheffield, acquired a plot in the hamlet and began to construct them for his family. There were 5 in total, 4 of which were in the shape of beehives. The site was badly vandalised in the 1980s and then rendered inaccessible to visitors. The landowner demolished the buildings in or around 2012. Illegally, I may add. Hollow Meadows also used to have a workhouse. The second, built by the former Sheffield Town Council, it stood on 48 acres of meadow and was the brainchild of one Isaac Ironside. An average of 45 able-bodied men were based at the site, which was nicknamed New England. From 1854, paupers were not permitted to engage in farming, only in clearing land. Ironside withdrew from involvement and the project gradually ran down. In 1879, the old workhouse site was converted into an industrial school for persistent truants before later becoming Hollow Meadows Hospital. Today, the site is occupied by housing. Right, now it's time to head up to Dungworth via Lode Brook and Hilltop. The journey continues with Dungworth, another hamlet located just to the west of the Sheffield suburb of Stannington. It's in some high agricultural ground at the eastern end of Damplast Reservoir. As hamlets go out here, this one has quite a lot compared to its parochial counterparts. It has a primary school called Bradfield Dungworth, a pub called the Royal Hotel, and a village hall. The pub has for a long time been a centre of village life. Historic records mention games of Nur and Spell, which were played there in the 1920s, and there were clubs for fishing, running, football and cricket. At Christmas time, people, still to this day, sing local traditional folk songs. All of this is under threat though, given there are some noises about the pub being closed sometime this year. This was filmed in late May, so my apologies if that has now happened between filming and releasing. Dungworth has no church, but there was once a medieval cross located northwest of the village. Industrially, this has always been a haven for dairy farming. At one time, there were 8 dairy farms in the area, each delivering their own milk to the surrounding district. Dungworth was also involved with the manufacture of knives into the 17th and 18th centuries, and coal was mined here too into the 19th century. 2 professional footballers once lived here. Sheffield United's Keck Caldwell was born here in 1929, and Manchester United goalkeeper Tony Hawksworth grew up here too. Next, we're driving through another hamlet, this time Stores. Although historically a farming settlement, Stores was largely associated with watermills and small-scale cutlery making. The Stores Brook flows just to the south of the hamlet and joins the River Loxley at Utley Bridge. The brook powered 2 mills. One was called Stores Mill, which was built in 1749, originally to manufacture snuff. It later became a paper mill. It's now a private residence. Loxley Wire Mill was further downstream, near the brook's confluence with the River Loxley. It dates from 1693 and was used as a cutler's wheel, a smelt mill, a wire mill and a corn mill over the years. The name Stores, by the way, is a derivation of the Old Norse word storth, which means a wooded place, and that's accurate given the number of trees out here. One of the first written references to the hamlet was in 1288, when the ancient Hallamshire family of Shaw established themselves right here. Stannington is the largest of the Sheffield suburbs to fall within Bradfield Parish. Most of its significant buildings, like this school, are all located around the centre of the old village, clustered around Stannington Park. Stannington has several churches. One of them can be found on the corner of Uppergate Road. This is the disused Knoll Top Chapel, which is attached to an old school next door. It's currently up for sale. Until 2014, Stannington had a council-run library, which was replaced by a volunteer-led facility, something which was quite controversial. This is the modern building nearby. Let's head into Stannington Park, where there's an information board about the place, not too dissimilar to the ones we encountered in Bradfield. The park is easily Stannington's biggest open space, and it has all the usual features and facilities that any good park does. It also has a cafe based around an old shipping container too, which we found quite unique. On a railing, we noticed an advert for the Stannington Carnival, which was due to take place in mid-July. After originating in the mid-1990s, the carnival was resurrected in 2022, and over the years, it's raised thousands of pounds for charity. Back to Uppergate Road, and this big brick building is the Stannington Medical Centre. Now, we haven't mentioned any bus services yet, so we will do here. Stannington is served by the numbers 81 and 82 from Sheffield, and the 61 and 62, which provide links with Dungworth, Low and High Bradfield, Loxley, and the Sheffield suburbs of Utley Bridge and Hillsborough. On the next corner is another ancient stone trough like the one in Warl, and standing tall opposite that is the biggest war memorial in Bradfield Parish. Stannington's is a large cross which honours all the men lost to war. Next, we pass Lomas Hall, the main communal building, left in trust to the people of Stannington in 1952 by Miss Flora Lomas. Next door, we have Christ Church. This was completed in 1830 by the architects Woodhead and Hurst of Doncaster. The foundation stone was laid in 1828 by Thomas Richard Ryder, who was the vicar of Ecclesfield at that time. Initially, Christ Church didn't have a vicar. Instead, it used a curate, William Gill, who lived in Bradfield. The exterior has had very few changes since it was built, but the interior, which originally had seating for 1,000 people, has been reordered several times. Pubs-wise, Stannington has a few. This is the Rose and Crown on Bankfield Lane, which the locals know as Minis. There are two other boozers close by, the Crown and Glove and the Peacock. To finish, let's talk industry again. Like Loxley, Stannington produced refractory bricks in the 1800s. If anything, it was more prevalent here due to the Stannington pot clay seam. J&J Dyson owned the Fire Brick Works on Stopes Road. Ganister was mined here too, mainly by Siddons Brothers. Sheffield steel may have been forged in the city, but it was only made possible by all the industry in the Loxley Valley. And that's it. We have walked around Stannington and we have completed the parish of Bradfield. How good was
lots
that?
of driving today, and you know there's going to be lots of shots where you see windscreen wipers. You'd have thought that for late May we'd have had some really nice weather. Sadly it wasn't to be, but you know, we've seen some beautiful sights though, some beautiful views, haven't we?
Even through the mist and the rain, you know. You know, it's still worth coming out here even if the weather is pretty bad, but it would have been better if the sun was out. But you can't have everything in this world, and you certainly can't have everything in this country, can you?
No, I mean we had to do lots of driving as well because of the sheer size of the place. If we'd have walked around every hamlet, every village, we'd have been here next week.
I'd have still been in Warl Cliffside.
Yeah.
Anyway.
So, what did you think, Lauren?
It was good.
Good.
Good. It's taken us all day.
We've got some goodies, so we've spent a few TVI pounds.
Yeah.
So I'm pretty sure that if you've not heard about them already, that you will, either on this video or check out Facebook.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's an enjoyable day, but I'm ready to go home.
So am I. Nikki, South Yorkshire is complete! I've completed a county! Only 47 to go. Well, not quite. It's 45 because two of the others don't have any parishes at all. That's it anyway. What a marathon that was. It took us pretty much an entire day to film this one, and even then there are bits we didn't go to. Even a 2-hour-long video for Bradfield wouldn't have been enough, so please don't complain about missing things in this one. This was TVI filming taken to the extreme, but what an experience. That's Sheffield and South Yorkshire both complete. See you soon elsewhere. Thanks for watching this video, folks. Don't forget to like this episode if you haven't already. It really makes a difference with YouTube. If you're new here, subscribe to the channel for more videos like this, and give us a share too if you've got friends who'd like it. You can find all the links to my social media accounts below, as well as my Buy Me a Coffee page where you can donate to the channel. Also, if you've enjoyed this episode, have a look at some more videos in this series. Until next time, I've been Andy, also known as the Village Idiot, and I'm out.